Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for sexualities and social issues. Today, we're going to talk about sexual violence. And this is a very hard topic. This is something that a lot of people experience, but not a lot of people talk about. And it's something that's heavily associated with trauma. So for some people, this could be the most difficult topic we cover all semester. So I wanted to say that there's not anything graphic in here, and there shouldn't be anything too triggering. But if this is a subject that is very difficult for you, I would encourage you to pause if you need to turn it off if you need to, and to take this video at your own pace. We are mostly going to talk about statistics and about general big picture things, but it's always important to recognize that your mental health counts. One of the most important things to address when we're talking about sexual violence is that among crimes, it's one of the least reported. So we know that this is something that happens often, but we also know that this isn't something that's reported often. So there is a difference between telling your friends or possibly a counselor and telling the police and pressing charges. And one of the things that we'll talk about today is that even though this is very common, people are very often afraid to be seen as the victim. So first, let's look at a little graph. And this graph is about any kind of sexual harassment and assault in the United States. You'll notice on the far left that, of course, it's incredibly common. But in the smaller graphs on the right, it's broken down into total in red, female in teal, and male in purple. So you'll notice that with verbal sexual harassment, cyber sexual harassment, physically aggressive sexual harassment, and straight up sexual assault, women always experience this at a higher rate than men. However, men absolutely experience this. And that's one of the things that we don't talk about enough in society. This is definitely also a problem for men. So one of the reasons that I think we often don't talk about this is that we're used to seeing it portrayed in the media. And very often, we're used to seeing it portrayed as just a natural thing that happens. So for instance, let's look at this ad. This is an ad that you might see in any magazine. Indeed, as you can see, I literally tore it out of a magazine. And it's an ad for an energy drink, but the thing that I want to draw your attention to is not just that these people are at a bar drinking an energy drink, it's the text where it says, "He spots his prey." So it's not about a man hitting on a woman, it's not about a possible future relationship, this is literally about a predator spotting prey. And that's a very normal way of thinking about this, and that's one of the reasons that assault is so common. But like I said, it's not exclusive to male on female violence. If we look at these pictures, we can see on the left the sort of stereotype of the nagging wife who maybe commits domestic violence against her partner. And on the right, this also sort of stereotype about a woman getting vengeance by slapping a man. So the idea of committing violence against your partner is something that we portray in a lot of different ways, but often we do portray it as comic, or we portray it as normal. And that's a big part of the problem. So what we're going to talk about today are all sorts of sexual violence. We're going to start at sort of the beginning with sexual harassment and work our way through to more serious crimes like sexual assault. So we have a lot to cover, and let's get started. So we're going to begin today with sexual harassment. So sexual harassment can take a lot of forms, and we're going to look at a few definitions, but we're going to start with the concept of sexual harassment in the workplace. So here is a pretty complex definition, but I wanted to draw your attention to a few key parts of it. Sexual harassment is unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature constitutes sexual harassment when submission to or rejection of this conduct explicitly or implicitly affects an individual's employment, unreasonably interferes with an individual's work performance, or creates an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. So the things that I think are important about this definition are first the kinds of harassment that are included. You'll notice that it's verbal, it's physical, it can sometimes be a quid pro quo, which means that you're asking for one thing in exchange for another thing. But also it can just be about the offensive work environment. It might not be that someone's being explicit about asking you for a favor. It might be that they're just constantly making terrible jokes or trying to show you pictures on their phone. So the important thing about sexual harassment is, one, it usually involves a power exchange. Very often, it's the result of a person who has power harassing a person who has less power. And two, it creates a workplace environment that is not conducive to work. So it's important to remember that when you're at work, you pretty much shouldn't be talking about sex, unless you have my job. But generally speaking, work belongs at work, and sex belongs outside of work. So sexual harassment in the workplace is a really important thing to recognize because it used to be incredibly common, and gradually it's getting less common. So one thing to think about is gender. Sexual harassment can happen to anyone, but it does most often happen to women. Probably about 2/3 of cases, especially those that are reported, are women. However, it's important to remember that sexual harassment does not have to be reported by the person who experienced it. If you witness any kind of sexual harassment, you can be the person who reports it. And often that is important, because your job might not be the one that's at stake. So remember that if you do see sexual harassment taking place, you can be the person who speaks up, and you can be the person who files the charges. Another important thing to remember is that even though women are very often the victims of sexual harassment, usually women are harassed by men, but men are harassed by both women and men. It's actually surprisingly common for men to harass other men in the workplace. So this is one of those things that we don't think about very often, because usually it's played as a joke, but remember, if it makes people uncomfortable, it doesn't belong at work. So let's look at a couple graphs. In this first graph, we're looking at how people feel about workplace harassment. And I wanted to show you this graph because I think it's important to note that even though sexual harassment used to be very common and something that almost all women experienced at work, these days we're starting to pay more attention to it. And one of the ways that you can see that changing is in graphs like this that measure how people feel about whether we're overreacting or possibly underreacting. So first, we'll look at this set on the right. In orange, it's people who say that other people are too sensitive to the problem of workplace sexual harassment. And in green, it says that people are not sensitive enough. So you'll notice that in 1998, for women, the majority did say that people were too sensitive. But over the course of the 21st century, we've sort of changed our minds. And these days we tend to believe, especially among women, that people are not sensitive enough. Similarly, in 1998, you can see that the vast majority of men thought that people were being too sensitive. But as time has gone on, men have begun to believe that in fact maybe they're not being sensitive enough, although it does come pretty close to equal in 2019. So basically the way we feel about workplace harassment has changed, and it's part of our changing social norms. We're constantly changing our social norms, and this is just another part of that. In this next graph, you can see that most US women have been sexually harassed. In the graph on the left, this is the share of women saying they have ever been sexually harassed by a man, and you'll notice that 60% say that they have, about 30% say they haven't, and the others don't know. On the right, this is the total share of Americans saying that it is a serious or not a serious problem. Again, you'll notice that 27% say it's very serious, 42% say it's somewhat serious, and 17% say not very serious. So the majority of Americans do believe that it's a problem, but not necessarily by much. And again, this could have a lot to do with gender. Finally, we have a graph about workplace productivity. So in this graph, we're looking at workplace harassment in terms of financial impact. So you'll see that people who have experienced workplace sexual harassment experience lower morale at a huge rate, decreased productivity at a reasonable rate, 1 1/4 of them quit, and some of them outright change their entire career. So sexual harassment in the workplace is not just a person-on-person problem, it could also be considered a financial problem. So this, if you're the kind of person who doesn't care about the personal issue, maybe you at least care about the economic issue, and that's one of the reasons that we're starting to see people address it. Lately, we've seen a substantial rise in both social resistance and legal resistance to workplace harassment. So you may have heard about the Me Too movement, which was popularized by #MeToo, which was when women came out and said that they too had been sexually harassed or assaulted in the workplace. One of the interesting things about this movement was that people appeared to not know how many of us have experienced this. So for a lot of people, it was kind of a surprise that it was such a common issue, again, because it's not always something that we talk about. We're also seeing a huge rise in legal resistance. There have been more reported cases, there have been more legal cases, and part of this has to do with the recent empowerment of women in the workplace. Historically, women have been kept out of the workplace, but as more and more women are educated and more women are employed, they're rising through the ranks, and they no longer have to put up with this. So we are starting to see some really powerful resistance. We're also starting to see people being afraid of this resistance. So you may have seen things like this, where men are talking about how they don't know what they can say anymore, or they're not even sure if they should hug people anymore. And again, my advice to people in the workplace is that sex belongs outside of the workplace. And if you're worried that you might be sexually harassing people, you should be worried. It's important to take stock of your own behavior and to remember that you shouldn't be making people uncomfortable, even if it is funny to you, and even if you have always done it. So a lot of men are worried about their behavior these days, and mostly we're okay with that. They can worry. These kinds of social adjustments, again, are a normal part of how society always evolves. So the Me Too movement has not had a lot of false accusations. This is, again, one of those rumors. People get so worried about false accusations. It's much more likely that people are getting away with it than they are being falsely accused. But it is still something worth considering. Your behavior in the workplace matters. So if you don't want to be falsely accused or correctly accused, don't do it. Remember to stay professional and do work at work. Another kind of harassment that I wanted to address is the kind that takes place outside the workplace and on the street. So here I'm mostly talking about catcalling and following women and yelling at them. And again, it's not specific to women, but it is very commonly experienced by women. So some 80% at least of women report having been catcalled. This is one of those things I would encourage you to ask your female friends. So this is a tricky issue because very often the people who are doing the catcalling will claim that it's supposed to be some kind of compliment, or that it's not harassment because they're only using their language. But this is a really tricky thing because generally speaking, you do not yell compliments at people. If you really wanted somebody to feel safe and appreciated and perhaps beautiful, you would not yell that at them on the street. So remember that if you would like to tell someone that they look beautiful on the street, do it in a non-threatening way. Do it peacefully and kindly, and don't yell mean words, and don't yell mean words if you feel like you got turned down. And if you are someone who is experiencing harassment, the advice that we give to children is pretty solid. Basically, you should shout no loudly, you should run away from that person and that place if you can, and you should tell someone you trust. And I don't necessarily mean you should report it, but talking about these kinds of things helps. And especially if we talk about these kinds of things with young people, it really helps us to prevent the same things happening in the next generation. So again, if you're experiencing catcalling, get out of there. If you're the one doing the catcalling, adjust your behavior. You might get better results. The next kind of sexual violence we're going to talk about is the sexual abuse of children. And this is a very difficult topic, because really it's one of the worst crimes that a human can commit against another human. The fallout is intense. The moral issues are clear. Pretty much everyone is against childhood sexual assault. But again, it's important that we talk about it, because one of the things that I want to make clear are the long-term impacts of having been abused as a child, and especially the people who are most likely to do the abusing. So let's start with the definition. Basically, childhood sexual abuse is a form of abuse in which an adolescent or adult uses a child for sexual stimulation. So again, it's not usually about the stimulation of the child, it's about the adolescent or the adult. And it can include things like asking the child to engage in activities, taking photographs to make pornography, exposure, and of course physical sexual interaction. So this kind of thing can start incredibly early and last for years and years without anyone knowing, because very often the perpetrators involve a lot of guilt, so the child is the one who carries the guilt and the secrecy. So again, one thing that's worth thinking about is how we're supposed to interact with children. So this is the advice that generally we give to children. Basically, there's good touch and bad touch, and you should know the difference. I really like these pictures on the right. Here they're sort of putting in color zones, good places to touch people and bad places to touch people. And this is true, right? If you're interacting with a strange child, the hands are fine, the head is fine, let's not touch the genitals. So this is the thing that's important to teach children, because most of their time they're controlled by other people. They don't have any agency in who touches their body or where they go or what they do. So it's important to remind them that they do have ownership of their own body, and they can dictate who touches it and where. Empowering children to say no is a very important part of this. It's also important to remember that the people who are most likely to assault your children are not strangers. We talk a lot about stranger danger, but the truth is that probably 10%, maybe less than 10%, of childhood sexual assault comes from strangers. It's actually much more likely that it will be someone in your family, about 30% are relatives, or that it will be someone with whom the child is acquainted. About 60% are acquaintances. So acquaintances might include people like coaches, or religious figures, or babysitters. Basically, these are people that you trusted to take care of your child, and that's part of the reason that it's so awful and so heartbreaking. So if we look at this next graph, you can see that in general, of course, the children know the perpetrator, but I just wanted to be very clear that it's about 90% of the time that people know the perpetrator. So it's important, if you have children, to make sure that they feel comfortable talking to you about what may be happening in their lives, and that they feel comfortable taking ownership of their bodies. Because the people that we least suspect are often the people who are actually doing the abusing. One thing that I wanted to make clear about the people who do the abusing of children is that most of the time they're male, about 96% of the time, but generally they have not themselves been assaulted as children. Some kind of abuse is learned. We'll talk later about physical domestic abuse, but this kind of abuse, the sexual abuse of children, is generally down to kind of a miswiring of the brain and not down to abuse they suffered themselves. So if you know a child who has been abused, they are not going to grow up to be an abuser. That said, they are going to experience a lot of difficulties. So I wanted to show you some things about how to know if a child might be experiencing something that might be related to abuse. So if you look at this chart, you can see that there are often a lot of behavioral symptoms. The child might experience a change in hygiene habits. They might go through extreme depression or anxiety. You might notice trouble with their grades or with their interactive relationships with their peers and teachers. They might start having nightmares. You might even notice that they straight up run away from home. So again, it's important to notice behavioral changes in the child because those can be indicative of something that they don't want to tell you about. And finally, I wanted to talk about the long-term effects. Generally speaking, children who suffer abuse are more likely as adults to develop ways of compensating for that abuse and dealing with that abuse that are unhealthy. So very often, we see that children who were abused sexually have heavy rates of drug dependence and alcohol dependence. They're about 5 times more likely than people who didn't experience sexual abuse, for instance, to have drug and alcohol dependence. They're also much more likely to experience depression and anxiety, and of course they're very likely to experience a combination of those things. It's very common for people to self-medicate, especially with problems that they haven't told anyone about. So the final thing that I want to show you is this graph about psychiatric and somatic manifestations. So sometimes people who have experienced trauma that they have not yet dealt with will literally have physical manifestations. They might have pain, they might have fatigue, they might have issues with tummies and issues with their, neurological systems. But they might also have psychiatric manifestations. Again, depression and anxiety are incredibly common, but you might see sexual dysfunction. Sometimes people deal with abuse by being promiscuous as an attempt to take back their sexual agency. So the long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse are many, and they are intense, and they are not your fault. So if you are someone who has experienced this, it's important to deal with your trauma. It sucks, but it doesn't suck worse than the things that you're probably already experiencing. So again, this is something that nobody brought on themselves, but it is something that people can suffer from for the rest of their lives. So it's very important that we talk about it. Next, we're going to talk about domestic violence. And there are 2 really important things to remember about domestic violence. And one is that it's perpetrated by someone that you're in a relationship with, someone you thought loved you, and that's one of the reasons that it hurts really badly. And 2, it's always part of a pattern. Very often we forget that these things happen in cycles. So let's look at a definition. This one says, a pattern of abusive behavior by one partner against another in an intimate relationship. So again, this is not stranger danger. This is someone that you trusted, very often someone that you live with. But the other important thing to remember is that usually it's not constant. And that is part of the reason that people tend to stay for so long in abusive relationships. Because a lot of the time, it is good. In this graph, you can kind of see the general pattern. Most of the time, there's an acute explosion, which means an explosion of violence, whatever kind of violence that is typical for that person. But then there's a honeymoon period. So directly following the bad part usually comes a really good part. Showering with gifts, promises it'll never happen again, reassurances about how much they love you, lots of loving physical interaction. But then that part ends, and the escalation of tension begins. And the tension will escalate and escalate and escalate until there's another outburst of violence, which will then be followed by an outburst of kindness. So it almost always goes in cycles like this. And that's one of the reasons that it's hard for people to understand, and one of the reasons that it's hard for people to admit and hard for people to leave. I also want to point out that it's not always physical abuse. Very often in domestic violence, the abuse starts mentally and verbally, and then it escalates to physical abuse, and from there, it can escalate further to financial abuse, often to murder. So I wanted to show you a few of the things that do count as domestic abuse. For instance, emotional violence. Trying to lower someone's self-esteem, trying to tell them every day that they're stupid or ugly or not valuable, that kind of thing is very common within domestic violence. But it could also include controlling behavior. Very normal for a domestic abuser to try to isolate you from your friends and family, possibly even to move you somewhere else, to take your phone away, to take your internet away, as part of a way of getting you away from the people that might save you and remind you that you are good. Manipulative behavior is very, very common, especially in terms of gaslighting or other ways of making you believe that you might be the problem. And of course, intimidation. Often, instead of physical violence, the threat of physical violence will exist, or the threat of physical violence against someone else, including pets or children. So even though often we think of domestic violence as just straight up physical beating, usually it's part of a bigger scheme of violence, of emotional violence, of intimidation, of isolation, and usually it's happening as part of a bigger, deeply unhealthy relationship. Domestic violence is one of those things that's much more prevalent than we think because people very rarely talk about it or report it. So if we look at these graphs, they're suggesting that 1 in 4 women will be subject to domestic violence over the course of their life. And again, that can include physical or emotional or verbal violence. This group also estimates that 1 in 14 men will, and that is especially rarely reported, because men are often embarrassed that they would be the victims of any kind of violence. In this graph on the right, they're breaking it down a little bit more. They're suggesting that 29% of women and 10% of men have experienced any kind of rape or violence or stalking, but that about half of men and women have experienced the emotional kind of domestic violence abuse. So again, it's surprisingly common for people to experience verbal abuse and psychological intimidation and not tell anyone. At the bottom of this graph, they're talking about people who have been physically injured, and you'll notice that that number is higher for women than for men, because very often women will use a more psychological kind of abuse against male partners, where men will often resort to violence. In this next graph, we're looking at how this is impacted by gender. And again, I want to be very clear that this definitely happens to people of every gender. However, we most likely see it reported by women. So women account for probably 85 to 90% of victims that are reported, but they might account for 80 to 95% of victims, period. It's hard for us to know because this is something it's very difficult to collect data about. Again, in this graph, you'll notice that physical assault and rape and physical assault are most often reported by women and very rarely reported by men. And again, we think this has to do with gender norms. It's not that it's not happening, it's that they feel like they're not supposed to tell anyone. So in our final graph on this subject, you can see that sometimes the kind of violence that is being experienced in an intimate relationship escalates all the way to murder. Generally speaking, if someone is willing to physically assault you, they are more likely to murder you. And very specifically, if someone strangles you, they are very likely to escalate to murder. So you can see in this graph that men make up the majority of murder victims, period. But when women are murdered, they are most likely to be murdered by their ex-partner or family member, or by an ex-partner themselves. So men are more likely to be murdered, but women are murdered, they're mostly murdered by husbands or ex-husbands, which is a great indication that domestic violence is a big part of violence against women in general. It's also important to remember that domestic violence is not specific to heterosexuals. It happens within all communities. But again, one of the problems is that reporting tends to be lower. Very often, people who are in same-sex partnerships don't want to report because they feel like there's already enough focus on their relationship and they don't want to damage the reputation of the groups that they're in. So it can be a lot harder for people who are in same-sex relationships to get help and to be taken seriously and to report their problems to the police. So it happens within all kinds of relationships, but it is a little bit easier to get help within heterosexual relationships, and that's something worth thinking about. So we've talked a little bit about gender, but it's also important to think about the other demographics and how they might impact domestic violence. So first, let's look at race. We know that domestic violence takes place among all races of people, but we also know that white women are the most likely to report. Even though in this graph it suggests that it's very common among Black couples and Hispanic couples as well, we know that their general distrust of the police makes them less likely to call the police in an instance of this happening. So even though this occurs in all kinds of communities, very often within Hispanic communities they prefer to handle it themselves, within Black communities they prefer to tell no one, and within white communities they prefer to call the police. However, that does also differ with class. Another one of the things that we know is that, again, domestic violence occurs within all classes, but people from the lower classes are more likely to report and to ask for help. And we think that this might do, one, with having no resources. If you need to leave your partner but you don't have accumulated wealth and you don't have somewhere to go, you are more likely to ask for help from the police and from domestic violence abuse centers. You'll notice in this graph that poor people, both urban and rural, are more likely to report and to ask for help. This is again in part because they need resources, but it might also be in part as a measure of trying to protect your reputation. We should also look at age. Interestingly, domestic violence is most likely to occur in your 20s and 30s. Any earlier than that, we don't see it very much, and any later than that, we don't see it as much either. So in this graph, you'll notice that we're looking at the victims of intimate partner violence. And it's heavier for women from 11 to 17. Men report a lot of it from 18 to 24. This is the age at which men are most likely to be abused. And then it begins to kind of even out. However, in this graph, we're looking at domestic violence offenders. And again, we'll notice similar patterns. It's pretty common in those 25 and under. It's very common in those in their 20s and 30s, and then it begins to go down after that. So essentially, domestic violence is most likely to occur among younger couples, and it becomes less and less likely as the couples age. But this might also have to do with reporting, and again, we have no real way of knowing, because we don't know when things occur if they're not reported. So finally, let's talk about leaving a situation that involves domestic violence. One of the things that is very difficult about domestic violence is that because it involves so much psychological trauma, it makes it more difficult for people to leave an abusive relationship. Very often they've been told for years that there's nothing else out there for them and that they are worthless and stupid. So if you have been told that kind of thing for so many years and you start to internalize that kind of thing, it does make you less likely to leave. So on average, women especially will leave about 8 times before they finally leave for good. And this is incredibly dangerous, because often if you leave and come back, the violence does escalate. So one of the things that we need to work on as a society is not just squashing domestic violence before it begins, but also helping people who are trying to leave. This is a very important way that you can begin to help your community by helping out at shelters, by helping out at hotlines, and even with donations. Because leaving is very difficult, and we need to make that as easy as possible for people who are ready to do it. Next, we're going to talk about sexual assault. And sexual assault can cover a huge range of activities, so I do want to focus first on some definitions. So first, here's a definition of sexual assault. An act in which a person intentionally sexually touches another person without that person's consent, or coerces or physically forces a person to engage in a sexual act against their will. So the most important thing to remember here is consent. Sexual assault can be really any activity that occurs without the consent of the other person. Usually, again, it's sexual in nature and it's physical, but it can have a huge range. On the other hand, when we're thinking about a definition for rape, it can get a lot more specific. Non-consensual sexual penetration of the body using physical force, the threat of bodily harm, or other forms of coercion, such as incapacitation with alcohol or other drugs. So it's important when we're looking at this definition to remember that their primary concern with rape is penetration. So sexual assault can be any kind of physical sexual touching, but when we talk about rape, usually we are talking about penetration. However, this leads to some confusion. For instance, does the penetration have to be by a penis? In some states it does. Different states can make up different definitions, and sometimes the law specifically indicates that only a man with a penis can rape a woman who doesn't have one. In other states, it could be a different kind of object. And what about the penetration? Does it happen somewhere other than vaginas? Could it be anal or oral penetration? Does that count equally? Can you rape people of other genders than women? These are things that we're kind of negotiating as we go. Our social standards about what counts change over the course of time. So there is an important difference between sexual assault and rape, and there are also a lot of different kinds of rape. So we're going to work our way through a couple of the ones that are most important and most prevalent. So the first category of rape that we're going to talk about is statutory rape. So statutory rape is any kind of rape of a minor. So basically the person who is being raped is under the age of 18. Well, one thing that's interesting about the legal definition of statutory rape is that the rapist could be any age. Usually, these kind of laws exist to protect young people from being raped by much older people, but you might have heard about things like Romeo and Juliet clauses, which say that as long as the people are within about 3 years of each other, it is okay. So you might have a situation with a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old, and technically that is illegal, but often it's covered under clauses like that. Another interesting thing about the legal definition of statutory rape is that the consent of the person who is being raped is not important. So if two 16-year-olds consent to have sex with each other, it still counts legally as statutory rape. And one or both of them could charge the other person, or one or both of their parents could charge the other person. So it can be kind of tricky legally to think about statutory rape, but the thing that's important to remember is that it's designed to protect teenagers from predatory adults. Another kind of rape that can be quite tricky legally is marital rape. So marital rape was not illegal in America until the 1970s. Historically, women have been considered property of the men to whom they're married, so it wasn't considered a person-on-person crime so much as it might be considered kind of a property crime. So in a lot of cultural traditions, it is acceptable for a husband to rape the wife. Sometimes it's considered a normal matter of course. But in modern American culture, it is finally illegal. But states can make up their mind about the limitations and the punishments on a state-by-state basis. So in some places, it's seen as kind of a lesser crime than if you raped a stranger. So again, even within sexual assaults and rape, our legal definitions kind of indicate what society believes to be important at the time. I also wanted to clarify that different societies think about marital rape differently. So if we look at this map, you can see that in some places it is criminalized. All of the places in red have laws against this. In other places, it's criminal only if you're separated, or it's a crime but not necessarily a specific dangerous crime. All of the countries shown in black, however, have no laws against this. So again, even though our standards in America are changing relatively quickly, around the world, sometimes this is a crime and sometimes it isn't. Another kind of rape that's very important to discuss is date rape or acquaintance rape. So very often, when we think about rape and sexual assault of any kind, we think about stranger danger. But it's important to remember that the majority of sexual assaults and rapes occur between people who know each other. So this definition says that acquaintance assault involves coercive sexual activities that occur against a person's will by means of force, violence, duress, or fear of bodily injury, but they're imposed upon them by someone they know. So if we look at this graph, you can see that this is actually incredibly common. Maybe about 20% of rapes are committed by a stranger, and all of the rest of them are committed by acquaintances, former partners, maybe a person you can't even remember, maybe someone to whom you're related. We think of this as something that only a stranger would do to us, but it's actually incredibly common for it to be someone that we do know. And honestly, that's part of the problem. One of the reasons that we see rape reported so rarely, and especially acquaintance rape, is because it can be really confusing to figure out if it was rape, like what if you were on a date, like what if you'd consented to kissing but not going this far. Very often people try to reframe the experience in their minds. They go back and think, well, I didn't say no, or they go back and think like, well, I was drunk, so maybe it doesn't count. So this one can be very confusing because we don't want to accuse someone that we know of having committed a crime. We don't want it to be known in our friend circle. We don't want to have to go to the police with this. We don't want it to be on record for the university. So often, this specific kind of assault is not reported because people don't want to acknowledge that it can happen among friends and acquaintances, and because people don't want it to be the thing that everyone else is talking about. So again, even though it's incredibly common, this is one of the least reported kinds of sexual assault. So next, let's think about some of our demographics. Again, this is one of the things that happens to all people, but it is more common among certain kinds of people and in certain situations. So first, let's think about gender. It may not surprise you to learn that rape is most commonly experienced by women. Probably about 92% of victims we think are women, and about 1 in 6 women will experience an attempted or completed rape over the course of their lifetime. So it is most commonly experienced by women, but that doesn't mean it isn't experienced by men as well. In this graph, you can see that while women are at a much higher risk, we do know that at least 3% of men have been the victims of a rape or an attempted rape. That said, rape among men is very low in reporting. Because of our issues with masculinity and with sexual prowess, very often men who experience sexual assault don't tell anyone, much less the police. So this might be the least reported crime of all. About 6% of men report having been victimized in their lifetime, but often they're talking about childhood assaults or teenage assaults as well. Among adult men, we just don't know how often it happens. We do know that male-on-male sexual assault is a relatively common thing outside of sexual interest. So it is sexual assault, but often it's used in prisons or in interrogations as a means of degrading or breaking the spirit of the man in question. So sometimes it's used as a form of assault that isn't quite sexual in nature, even though generally speaking we do consider it to be a sexual crime. Another thing worth considering is that when we think about men who have been raped, very often we think that it must have been penetration, and it could, of course, be anal penetration or oral penetration. But like we talked about in sex ed, erections are involuntary bodily responses. And this means that sometimes you can't will one into existence or will one out of existence. Sometimes the body is just responding to stimulation. And one of the things that happens to a lot of people in traumatic situations, especially in situations where they're being assaulted, is that their body kind of shuts down and they begin to dissociate. So for a lot of people, the sort of fight or flight response ends up with freezing, and they just find themselves incapable of thinking or moving or fighting back. But that doesn't necessarily mean that for men, they're incapable of getting an erection. So for a lot of men, including those who have been drugged, or including those who are drunk, they are capable of getting an erection, but that does not mean they're capable of giving consent. So it's important to remember that even if one bodily activity is happening, that does not mean that that person is prepared to have sex. Another key demographic factor is race. Again, we know that this occurs among people of all races. However, we also know that reporting does not occur equally among people of all races. So much like domestic abuse, it can be really hard to get these numbers. So if we look at this graph, we can see the average number of sexual assaults by race of victim per year. But again, this data is collected by national assault hotlines. So this data is only able to be collected from people who report it. So again, we see more white people reporting than we do any other race, but that doesn't necessarily mean that white people make up the majority of the victims. Similarly, class has a lot to do with it. We know that people of all social and economic classes experience sexual assault. However, we also know that the poorest women are the most likely to be sexually assaulted, and the wealthiest men are the most likely to be exonerated for those crimes. So it's not that there's a class relationship necessarily between who is assaulted and who does the assaulting, but there is a power relationship. And very often, class and power kind of go hand in hand. So exceptionally wealthy people, again largely men, often feel like it's not as bad a crime to assault someone who is less powerful and often less wealthy than they are. And historically, they have gotten away with it. We've only seen repeated perpetrators, such as Harvey Weinstein, arrested in very recent years, even though everybody knew for decades that he was doing this. So class and power do have a lot to do with it, but it also has a lot to do with reporting and punishment for the crimes that they have committed. The next thing to consider is age. Sexual assault is much more common among younger people. So basically, again, if we look at this graph, you can see that it is the most commonly reported among people age 18 to 34, and then next most common among people a little bit older than that. One of the things that we know that is especially upsetting is that it's very commonly experienced in the college atmosphere. So essentially, college is a collection of young people, often assumed to be sexually active. There's a high prevalence of partying, there's a lot of alcohol, there's a lot of drugs, and again, there's hookup culture and the expectation that other people are also hooking up. So we do see sexual assault occur a lot in the college environment, but also among people who are that age. So let's look at some graphs. In this first graph, you can see that women who are in sororities are more likely to experience rape than other college women. This may have something to do with fraternity men being more likely to commit rape than other college men. So if women in sororities are hanging out with men in fraternities, it does make sense that they would be more likely to experience rape because the men are more likely to perpetrate it. We can also see that among college students, roughly 98% of the sexual violent perpetrators are male, or at least again of those reported, and about a quarter of women have experienced attempted or completed sexual assault since entering college. But I do want to be clear that this isn't just happening among people who are in college, it's also very commonly happening among people who are college-aged. So in this graph, we're looking at the fact that women who are the right age to be in college, 18 to 24-ish, are much more likely to experience sexual assault. So among all women that age, college women are 3 times as likely, but women who are not in college are 4 times as likely. And again, we think this is often situational. These are the people most likely to be meeting strangers. These are the people most likely to be partying. This is the people most likely to be in a group of people who are their own age, which again can help lead to assault numbers. So the idea that women experience sexual assault at a certain age also has a lot to do with what else is happening at that certain age. Most of these women are not yet coupled up. Most of these women are out in the world. So again, it's not your fault for being that age, it's not your fault for being at college, it's just that it's most common in situations like this and among women who are that age. Another incredibly important kind of assault to address is the rape that occurs among military members. So historically, this has been common, but we also haven't known much about it because the military essentially has their own system of justice and their own court system. So they've been handling these matters internally. But it's also important to acknowledge that it's very difficult to report rape when there's a specific chain of command, because very often what happens is that the victims are expected to report to the person who assaulted them. There's also a very heavy code of secrecy. So a lot of what happens within the military is supposed to be kept within the military, and that does include assaults. But we're beginning to learn more about it, not just as more women join, but as more men are comfortable talking about their experiences. Because one of the things that we're seeing is that yes, there's an extraordinarily high number of women who are raped by other members of the military, but male members of the military are actually at least 3 times more likely to be assaulted by other men. So the majority of the sexual assault that occurs within the military is male on male, but we are beginning to hear more about the male on female, and of course, the female on female. Another thing that's important to remember about sexual assault in the military is that infidelity is technically illegal. So if a married person commits a rape, technically they have committed 2 different crimes, the rape and the infidelity. However, what often ends up happening is that if a married man commits a rape on an unmarried woman, the unmarried woman is punished for the infidelity, and she is the one who is demoted or moved to another station. There are multiple reports of this happening all across America. So if we look at this graph, you can see that there has been a sharp increase in reports of sexual assaults in the US military. Again, we don't really know how often it's happening. The lighter red are the estimated number of incidents, but the darker red are those that are formally reported. And it's very important to note that the formal reports have gone up, even though the suspected estimated number of incidents has gone pretty steadily down. So this is one of those problems that we have known about, but again, that we are only now starting to socially address. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the victims of sexual assault, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about the perpetrators. So the kinds of people who commit rape do have some characteristics in common. Number one, they're prone to controlling behavior. They try to control a lot of things in their life, and especially a lot of people in their lives. Number two, they're generally known to the victims. Again, at least 80% of rapes occur by people who know the person that they are raping. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is that usually if a person will do something like this, they will do it repeatedly. So for instance, if we look at this graph, they're measuring the percentage of all rapes that are committed by repeat rapists. And these are 2 different studies, but in one they found that 91% of rapes were repeat rapists, and in the other 95%. So even though there's a little bit of discrepancy between those, they're both bad. Another thing that we know is that the racial breakdown does tend to be pretty steady. It's majority white, especially majority white men, followed by black men, and then lesser and lesser groups in terms of the other racial identities. Another thing that we know, again, is that it tends to happen repeatedly. However, it's not just rapes. You'll also notice that the kind of people who commit rapes also tend to commit robberies and assault and batteries. So more than half of people who have been charged with a rape have also been charged with at least one other thing. Very often other rapes, other batteries, but also often other crimes. So the kinds of people who commit rapes can come from all sorts of different social classes and really all sorts of different races and ethnicities, but it's important to remember that they do have patterns, and those patterns involve criminal behavior, controlling behavior, and doing this kind of thing more than once. The lasting effects of having been raped are impactful and heavy and awful. So very similar to childhood sexual abuse, we know that people who have suffered this kind of trauma tend to carry it with them, often for the rest of their lives. And the things that they do to try to deal with their trauma can be very damaging. So for instance, we know that people who have experienced rape are much more likely, 3 times more likely, to suffer from depression and 6 times more likely to suffer from PTSD. In order to deal with that kind of depression and that kind of trauma, they are 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, but they are 26 times more likely to abuse drugs. This is often done as a kind of self-medication, as a way of numbing their thoughts and numbing their pain. However, they're also 4 times more likely to contemplate suicide. So even though this is something that might be brief, this is something that has long-term lasting effects. And that's one of the reasons that we need to deal with it. Part of the reasons that it can be very difficult is that often people who experience rape do not report it. If we look at this graph, they're estimating that about 70% of rapes are not reported, but in other studies it's estimated that it's much higher than that, perhaps as much as 9 out of 10. Again, this often has to do with our confusion about definitions. What if it is someone you know? What if it is someone you've hooked up with previously? Very often, the only kind of rape that gets reported is the stranger kind, because people are too confused or too embarrassed about all the other kinds. Another reason that people are unlikely to report is that rapists very rarely get punished. Again, if only 1, maybe 2 out of 10 is reported, of course, they don't suffer legal consequences or go to jail. But even among those that are reported and are charged, as you can see here, the likelihood that they will spend even 1 day in prison is low. So in this graph, again, they're estimating that 32% is reported, which I do still think is high. But that would lead to 7 arrests, 3 referrals to prosecutors, 2 felony convictions, and then again 2 rapists who spend a single day in prison. So for a lot of the victims of rape, it feels kind of pointless to go through this, and to tell everyone, and to have this really invasive physical examination. So I think it's very understandable that people suffer these long-term effects, because they feel like they have to carry this silently and deal with it themselves. So one of the major changes that I think that we need to take on as a society is making it easier and more common to report, and making it much more common to punish the people who have done something like this. One of the reasons that people so rarely report rape has to do with the cultural messages that we have concerning rape. And specifically, we tend to blame the victims. There's a long cultural history of saying that people who have experienced sexual assault were in some way to blame. Sometimes we think that we're to blame because of their outfits. In this meme, they're suggesting that dressing immodestly is like rolling around in manure, because you'll get attention, but mostly from pigs. So again, historically, no matter what the women are wearing, it has been suggested that it is somehow the fault of their outfit. Sometimes we hear it suggested that it's their fault for drinking. In this meme, they're saying that a woman who drinks until she passes out and then is raped is somehow at fault, as though what happens to our unconscious bodies has anything to do with our choices. We also hear that if women get pregnant from having been raped, that it's their fault. This man, who was running for U.S. Senate, said that he thought that women's bodies have ways of shutting that whole thing down, and that essentially if you were raped and you got pregnant, it must somehow be your fault because your body should have shut that down. When in fact we know that among women who seek abortions, it's very rarely because they were the victim of rape. We also see women blaming women for this. This woman was doing an interview in which she said that either women can handle their liquor and make responsible choices, or they can't, in which case they're a bunch of babies. So again, this woman is suggesting that your inability to stay sober is your fault, or that alcohol poisoning is your fault, or that being drugged is your fault. And this is part of a larger social issue in which we blame victims, but especially we blame women. So I want to show you this graph, which is basically a pyramid of rape culture. And what this graph is suggesting is that the kinds of things that we allow start small, and they start relatively innocuous, and then they work their way up to becoming more serious. So for instance, in a culture that finds rape jokes and locker room banter acceptable, it's perfectly predictable that people will begin to escalate to catcalling, and then they'll escalate to non-consensual videos, and then they'll escalate to threats and coercion. If they don't get punished for any of that, and perhaps they get rewarded for that kind of behavior, they will continue to escalate. They will escalate into contraceptive sabotage, into molestation, into drugging, and if they're not punished for any of that behavior, they will escalate into rape. So the point that this pyramid is making is that this kind of thing doesn't happen in a vacuum. People don't just decide to rape. People start with jokes to kind of test the water, and then they start with assault to see if that's going to be a problem, and then they escalate. So there's a much bigger social problem in terms of victim blaming and accepting things like boys will be boys, instead of holding people accountable for their actions. So the messages that we hear about rape and sexual assault are usually either that someone is overreacting or that someone is to blame. And it's important to remember that power always has a lot to do with this. So anytime you see locker room banter, or the kind of jokes that make you uncomfortable, it's important to call them out, because stopping these things right where they start could be culturally very helpful. The final thing that I wanted to talk about are some of the messages that you might see in regard to preventing assault. So these kinds of things have been popping up, especially on college campuses, so you might have seen this. Here's a very popular one: how to reduce your risk. And it talks about being prepared by staying with buddies. It talks about being alert by watching out for trouble. And of course, being assertive by using a confident voice and body posture. You might also have seen something like this, suggesting that alcohol is a rape drug and you are responsible for how much you've had already. Now, I want to be clear that both of these things are true. You should try to stay smart. You should try to stay aware of things. You should keep track of how much you're drinking. But I hope that you noticed that these messages are still just victim blaming. These still suggest that it is somehow your fault for not being alert, or it is somehow your fault for having alcohol. And what I would like to see more of are messages like this. Here are some rape prevention tips. Number 1, don't put drugs in people's drinks in order to control their behavior. And it goes on to suggest things like going around with someone else if you're afraid that you might rape someone, or carrying a whistle that you could blow if you're afraid that you might rape someone. And things like remembering not to assault people if they're unconscious or in an elevator. And finally, I like this poster a lot because it's talking about things that cause rape, and you'll notice that flirting doesn't cause rape, outfits don't cause rape, drinking doesn't cause rape. Only one thing causes rape, and that thing is rapists. And we forget this so often. We are so anxious to blame things like alcohol and miniskirts that we forget that only one person has the power to prevent rape, and it's the person who is doing the rape. So we have to be more careful as a culture about putting blame where it belongs and about stopping this kind of behavior right at the root. So, I hope you made it through this lecture okay. I know we dealt with a lot of heavy stuff, but I think that it's really important that we talk about these things and that we begin to make social changes so we can correct these things. And I'm looking forward to talking about it with you. So if you have any questions, please email me. And stay safe. I'll see you next time.